maybe you wanted to start with that, the first question we had from the front row here.
Okay. Could you repeat the question again?
I just wondered if in this narrative, or I guess there's two versions of it, the Chinese vis-a-vis Tibetan identity, if the rise of esoteric Buddhism practice in China by non-Tibetan people plays into the narrative in any way or changes it?
Yeah, actually, as I said, it's a very intricate question because, first of all, you have Tibetan Buddhism, if I can just call it Tibetan Buddhism, in China in the pre-modern period. This is really what, it's the crucial component in the religious relationship between Tibetan hierarchs and non-Tibetan rulers. It actually starts with the Tanguts and it goes on to the Mongols, to the Ming, to the Manchus. And it comes out of, if I can put it crudely, the Buddhism of an emperor is going to be qualitatively different from the Buddhism of a layman. And there is a real serious, there is a tradition, a power tradition within Buddhism. There are actually texts about this. One of the earliest ones that I found, in Tibetan was how to usurp power. Now, like all good tantric texts, the first thing you have to do is abandon all self-interest. So you have to basically go after power without any interest, self-interest in having it. The only purpose is to do benefit for sentient beings. And so to become a chakravartin, or in Tibetan they say topki kwalo gyawagyapo, which is a bala chakravartin, somebody who turns the wheel of dharma, rules through turning the wheel of dharma, but does that through power. And the text itself basically gives an illustration of that. It talks about somebody who is, it begins with the story in India. There is a local ruler, there's a ruler, he's doing harm to sentient beings, suppressing the Dharma, and finally this yogin who doesn't want to do any harm to anybody else, it's like Popeye, that's all I can stands, I can't stands no more. And basically performs the necessary rites and rituals and gets rid of the guy, as it were. And there are all these rites and rituals dealing with power, which become part of this ritual. There is a Sakya text, which we have in the collection of that most American libraries with Tibetan programs have, the PL 480 collection of texts reprinted in India. And it's a Sakya text, and because it's reprinted in India, it has an English language title and an English language introduction, although the text is in Tibetan. And the English title is How to Destroy Your Enemies Using Mahakala. And the introduction says, it must be understood that this is not to be attempted without the proper initiations. Which of course means that, if you're going to do this, you should be without any self-interest whatsoever. Sort of, I don't want to get into Tantra and sex, but if you can imagine, sex without any interest in desire, without any desire, then. So you have this Tibetan tradition in China already. And, by the way, these rituals also are, in the Chinese perception, there's an historical perception of Tibetan Buddhism, which, like the Western perception of, Tantra, it's all about sex. That's all that, you have people, who believe that that's all that Tantra is. It's just, I don't, hey baby, I'm a tantric Buddhist. You want some enlightenment? This is what people think in the West. And actually, it's very interesting because during the period of the overthrow of the Mongols and the rise of the Ming, there are Chinese texts which specifically talk about Tibetan lamas debauching the royal women with these rituals. So, this is a common sort of perception. Now, there is a tradition, it's very, 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 very minor, of Tibetan Buddha, or some Tibetan Buddhist practices which go into Chinese Buddhist sects. But there is a Chinese tradition of esoteric Buddhism called Midzong, which does exist. But what we see now in the modern period is a Chinese interest in Tibetan Buddhism, and there are Chinese who are take teachings from lamas. In Sertad, the Jigme Punso, who was a teacher deceased several years ago. He had a big encampment. He had some foreign students. He had some Chinese students there as well. But this is a small, small minority. People sometimes say to me, I get the question, well, what do Chinese think about Tibet? And aside from the fact that, there are a lot of Chinese, a lot of different ideas, the overwhelming vast majority of Chinese do not think about Tibet. It's not there. They're not walking around, it's not like the Vietnam War, in the 60s and 70s in the United States where, most people had an opinion about this or that. Most Chinese don't think about Tibet, but when it does come into their consciousness, as in 2008, when you had, demonstrations and protests all across the Tibetan plateau, more often than not, if you ask most Chinese, it's, oh, those ungrateful Tibetans, we liberated them from this barbaric feudal serfdom, and this is, and this is what they do. But most of the time, people are just not thinking about that. Those Chinese who are interested in Tibetan Buddhism, and I've met a number of them. I've met Chinese in the entourages of lamas visiting Beijing and elsewhere. It is a very depoliticized view. In fact, I would say the view of Tibet, other than the, oh, these Tibetans, why are they so ungrateful? The other view is this, interestingly, this Shangri-La view of Tibet, like some of the more recent paintings that one saw up there. But there is a Tibetan attitude in exile, which, it's very similar to a view which many Tibetans used to have maybe 15, 20, 25 years ago, that, oh, the West is converting to Tibetan Buddhism, because so many Tibetans were just meeting Westerners who happened to be Buddhists passing through Dharamsala, so they decided, oh yes, the West is converting to Tibetan Buddhism, this is going to save Tibet. Well, no. And the same thing in China today. Yes, you can notice that there are Chinese who follow Tibetan Buddhism. It's a small, small minority. And in addition to which, I'll just end in this because there is a member of the audience who was with me on a visit to Chengde, the Manchu capital, in which you have these replicas, life-size, not models, but life-size replicas of the Potala Palace and of Tashi Lumpo, built by the Emperor Qianlong when the Panchen Lama was going to come on a visit. And now this is an important Buddhist site, and Tibetans will visit. They'll go on pilgrimage up there in southern Manchuria. And we went there, and there was a lot of Buddhism there in the placards and everything else. And you even had the staff dressed in semi, and I really mean semi, kind of monastic. It meant to suggest monastic garb, but it wasn't monastic garb. It was their uniform. And with us also was a Tibetan, and so, being, my usual nasty personality, I just said, oh, let me go up to this guy and just speak to him in Tibetan and see what happens. And so I went with this. Now, the Tibetan friend was from the PRC, so I spoke in Tibetan, and the guy was like this, and my friend said in Chinese, oh, don't you speak Tibetan? And he said, oh, yes, I speak Tibetan. And he said, he's speaking Tibetan. I mean, he probably thought I was speaking English or something. And the next thing was, oh, we have so many people waiting in line. No, we don't really have time for this. Please move on. And the point of meeting these well, I guess the staff there, was apparent throughout all, the whole complex of the Potala and Tashi Lumpo. People were going there. This is what they perceived the effect of Buddhism. Buddhism is there to make you rich. You will become wealthy if you do this or that. So much of, and even written, do this, and you will get what you'll become wealthy. And people were there doing the various puja or choga, the ceremonies. I mean, these are not Tibetans who are doing this. This is Chinese who are doing it, and it's all pseudo, very, very pseudo. But the perception is that this will help them become wealthy or whatever. I guess the bottom line of all of this is, I really see the perception of the Tibetan Buddhism as being practiced, except for a small minority. I mean, there are people who really do understand this. There are such a minuscule minority of what is already a minuscule minority of people interested in Tibetan Buddhism in the People's Republic of China, that I don't see them, at least at this moment in time and in the immediate future, having much of a role in this. But who knows? It's just an opinion.
May I say one thing?
Yeah.
It's just a small anecdote, and I know that's part of the reason I asked the question. mention, but it was in the airport in Shanghai. Everywhere I turned, there was a book with a Tibetan Lama on the cover. There were obviously bestsellers, and there were at least 4 different varieties in just a couple of bookstores that I went to. So,
Yeah, and
who
there.
knows what the content was? I don't really.
Yeah, well, I'd have to look at it, but I mean, there are teachings about being happy, which always puts me in mind, whenever when I speak to some classes, and they ask me things about Buddhism and how you can find happiness through Buddhism, and the first thing I say is, look, Four Noble Truths, the first thing you have to find is misery, okay? You have to realize, that, you're miserable. That's the thing about Buddhism, misery through Buddhism. Then maybe you can work on, but you can't be searching for happiness. You should transcend all that. And I have to say, a lot of it is, and I've seen books like this in the bookstores in Beijing and elsewhere. It's not too dissimilar from, the sort of Buddhism / self-help that you find, in the sections of certain bookstores.
Yeah.
Oh, I would just, the only thing I would just say that's, I guess, slightly contradicting what you're saying, but I probably don't have the numbers. Having been in Bodh Gaya recently, I was struck by, and all the life sites, how many people are on pilgrimage compared to 5 and 10 years ago. That's really gone way up, and it's mostly East Asian, but that's broadly East Asian, all the East Asian countries. So there are lots of pilgrims, and that was true in Bhutan as well. They were that was, again, people were going to Bhutan primarily, let's say half or a quarter were Americans wanting to see the mountains, and 3/4 were probably people on spiritual retreats who were visiting the country. But still small numbers when you think of the total populations.
Yeah, I mean, it is small numbers. Also, a lot of, you have a lot from Taiwan and also from Korea and elsewhere. But don't get me wrong. I mean, there are Chinese who are interested in Tibetan Buddhism. A lot of them, a lot of them. I mean, they will do these voyages, but they can be as flaky as Westerners, about the whole thing. And then you have some who are really sincere, and and not only sincere, who are really learned. I mean, I've met a lot of learned people too. But I guess what I'm really talking about is quantity. It's a very, very, very small percentage. But look, I know I have Chinese friends who read Tibetan very well and have a really profound understanding of Tibetan Buddhism. Small number. I guess what I'm talking about is the mass phenomenon, and that's something different.
Hi, I just want to say, Tenzing, it's so special to have you here. And I'm so glad you're here. And I know how busy you are with the show in London. So I just feel it's quite an honor to have an artist at the show who's participating. So first I just want to say thank you for being here. And I also wanted to ask you about, I think Elliot said this very well, where he said that he sees a lot of these images as Tibetans representing themselves. And surely your work is multivalent, right? Sometimes it feels highly political, sometimes it feels highly personal. And I wonder if you could speak to that idea of if you feel that your work is speaking for more than yourself, your own experience, if it's a community in exile, if it's a community in Queens, if it's, that's, and part of that is the audience, right? Who you're speaking to and what kind of discussion you hope that will enliven. And then also, I had the chance to see as part of your Bringing Tibet Home, which I really recommend everyone see. I saw the Kickstarter video, which was incredibly moving to me. And what Tenzing did you speak to it, but he brought 20,000 kilos of soil from Tibet to Dharamsala, and that to allow for individuals to interact with the land, and that sense of connection to the land, which I resonate with and surely has roots in the Tibetan tradition. Maybe you can speak to that, but also the element of that being such a community project, and thinking about who you're speaking to, who you're working for, and who's the audience that you feel that dialogue is.
Thank you. Actually, Even when I sometimes make artwork or certain artworks, even I ask the same question. And also, in the end, I think I make all those artworks for myself. And I think because if somehow you're thinking of an audience, then if you be greedy, then you need to make it for 7 billion people. But then you cannot somehow like fit that. So I think for me, I thought it was easier if I make something for myself genuinely, then somehow that would connect to everyone. So also interesting is if you look at even the Tibetan philosophical movements or the Western philosophical movements. All the Western philosophical movements is it comes out of arguments. One philosopher argues the other, and then there's a new philosophy, and then the whole tradition is through rebuttal. Whereas in Buddhist philosophy, they work very hard to be a footnote of Buddha. So, and then what you see is, I sometimes joke and say, all what we have is lemba, means when something is torn, you make a patch. So you're patching the Buddha so much that it's like, it's now, you can't even see the Buddha. And the idea that I actually encourage myself and others is to really be individual, to speak one's own mind. And I also think a lot about the word political, which I have very difficult time understanding. Because there was one very nice Chinese curator whom I met in Norway, and he's a very nice guy, and he said, I really would like to have a show with you, and you know what, we'll have a good show, I'll bring lots of Chinese friends and all, and just don't make any political. And I said, okay, how about this? You repeat that same sentence to me, but instead of using political, just say whatever you think or your personal truth. Then when you say that sentence, repeat to me, it's almost like saying, you make an artwork which is not what you think or not your personal truth, then it's really weird, isn't it? So I think, so on that context, I think all my work, I try to read. I've read lots of Sperling's book, amazing book, Jamen Nubu and all the Shakapa and all those. And then also I take interviews of Tibetans who are really elderly, whether they're initially when they were in exile or all those. And then from there, the artwork really comes. And so it's almost like I pick from their experiences and see if it connects to me, and then the artwork is there. So something like that.
But since this is called Tibetan Identity and Culture Symposium, I'm wondering, is all Tibetan identity and culture based in Buddhism? Is that what it is? Or is there something else too?
You know, well, identity is fluid, you know, and identity is multiple. People have multiple identities. I mean, each one of us here, you know, depending upon certain circumstances, will see ourselves as this or that. You might see yourself as, I don't know, you know, as a Jew or a Christian under some circumstances, as an American or a New Yorker under other circumstances. You know, it all depends. Buddhism is a big part of what Tibetans see themselves as, but I want to say that a lot of that is circumstantial too. And when I say that, what I mean is that in a traditional Tibetan environment, I don't think many Tibetans would think of themselves, oh yes, Buddhism is a big part of our identity because it's just all around you. You don't think about it. In the confrontation with China, it becomes a big part of the identity. I guess the analogy I'm making, the fish isn't aware of the water, until the fish is no longer in the water. I mean, it's just there. Buddhism becomes a very important marker of identity. I mean, it's certainly a part of the identity, now in a very political sense, a politicized identity, in the same way that being Catholic was very much a part of the Polish identity vis-a-vis Orthodox Russia in pre-modern times, and then the communist Soviet Union later on. It becomes very much, an important marker of identity. To say that is not to say that Tibetan writings don't ignore Buddhism. Buddhism is there and it's mentioned all the time, but not as in we are Buddhists as opposed to these other people who are not Buddhist. I think I'm going to dig myself a hole with this because I'm just going to contradict myself. The identity is there. The question is, what is its significance? And the identity changes based upon certain circumstances. Certainly in Tibet's confrontation with engagement with the outside world over the centuries. As I said, Tibet was not a uniquely religious place because in an age of faith, many places were religious. But the Tibetans were perceived as the practitioners of esoteric Buddhism par excellence, that they could do things that others couldn't. And in many ways, they were seen as the inheritors of a power tradition in Buddhism from India. But Buddhism was very much pervasive. It wasn't the only tradition in Tibet. Although here, again, we can have a big argument about what was the pre-Buddhist tradition of Tibet and did it exist unchanged after the 11th century? That's a big argument there. But whatever the intensity, the level of intensity of that Buddhist identity previously, and again, Tibetans had all sorts of other identities as well. And there's nothing wrong with that. People often say that, Tibetans didn't see themselves as Tibetans. They saw themselves as Khampas or as Amdawas. Everything is circumstantial. People have multiple identities. They do have multiple identities. But in the modern world, in the modern confrontation with China, and also the modern engagement with the West, there are other factors which play into this and give this Buddhist identity, or this, just the sense of Buddhism, all sorts of different significance which it did not have before. That is to say, Buddhism is what differentiates, or Tibetan Buddhism differentiates a Tibetan from Chinese. On the other hand, Buddhism is what makes Tibet so valuable to the West that desperately needs Buddhist tradition, and this is the preciousness that goes on, which is also, it has a lot of negatives that go with it as well. Just to give you an idea, this is somewhat irrelevant, but I'll throw it in there so you know who you're dealing with. A friend of mine has a project to translate Western literature into Tibetan, which I think is extremely important. I think it's very important. If you're in China today, you can find, most of the great books of, Western literature are available in Chinese. In other words, a Chinese intellectual, a Chinese student can engage with the international currents of intellectual activity. A Tibetan who doesn't read Chinese, a Tibetan either has to read Chinese or English in order to do the same. And so we were talking about what books to translate. And already a few have been translated, but one which I suggested early on was On the Road. And the reason I suggested it was, Allen Ginsberg's description of Kerouac's prose as, bop prosody. In other words, I say, you need a Tibetan equivalent to wrench the Tibetan written language out of so much of the classical conventions, which make it that much difficult for ordinary Tibetans to pick up a book and just read it like that. Second one, which I suggested, was Tropic of Cancer. And my attitude there is, in terms of Tibetan engagement with modernity, excuse the crudity of my language, but Tibetans piss and shit, they screw, they cheat, they lie, And they do lots of good things too. In other words, just like everybody else. And it's about time they stopped carrying this burden of having to be so precious, precious, precious. So the rest of us can cheat and lie and screw and piss and shit. But we know that because we like the Tibetans, we're okay. Oh, we patronize the Tibetans. In other words, this being drawn into modernity. So I don't think I answered your question, but
Yeah, I would like to add a few more to what Sir has said. I think also in many of the writers, especially after Cultural Revolution, they wanted to, I mean, Buddhism in a way, like every way of life is somehow looped in Buddhism and all this tradition in Tibetan. And so there were many writers who began this, they need to make, if it's art, if it's literature, they want to make it secular. And some has even revisited history, looked at what has happened in Tibet. If Tibet had all this great religion, all these deities and everything, then why did we lose our country? So there was this re-evaluation of Tibetan Rinpoche, or the one that's precious. So in that way, there were many writers like Dawa Nula, who's passed away, who also got under attack when he wrote those books. Jamia Nubula, who's really pushing Tibetan exile or inside Tibetans to really think without being dependent on Dalai Lama or dependent on being religious, you know. So all those things, I think the young generation of Tibetan are really, they might want to be a Buddhalogist, but not a Buddhist. So they want to study, analyze, but not really blindly take the leap, you know. So there, I think in literature, in art, in many of those other fields, you see that Tibetans trying to form a new identity, which may have an influence of Buddhist influence, but still, yeah, those kind of things, I think. So yeah, I thought, yeah.
Now, isn't there a traditional Tibetan religion called Bon or something? That had an impact on Tibetan Buddhism?
There's that's such a okay, yeah. There is first of all, there is a tradition in older text of Pön, and it's spelled B-O-N, but it's pronounced Pön. And there are certainly survivals of Pön, you know, in the modern world. If you go to a Pön monastery, and that should already tell you that, Pön monastery, you'll see practices, you'll see monks wearing robes, and you know, you'll see text kanjur, tengyur, and you might say, well, isn't this Buddhist? And it's not. They have their own canon, although a lot of the arrangement, they share certain traditions in common with the Nyingma, one of the sects. But you know, what I'm saying is that the modern Pön that we have today is a product of that same period of ferment in the 10th, 11th centuries that produced the different sects in Tibetan Buddhism, the beginnings of the different sects in Tibetan Buddhism. It was a period of tremendous intellectual ferment and activity, but clearly, when you look at it the way it is now, it could not in its present form have been what was practiced during the imperial period in Tibet. I mean, the religious picture prior to or in the imperial period, prior to the triumph of Buddhism in Tibet, I think is far more complicated. The situation that you have in Tibet, on the Tibetan plateau, is, you know, in the 7th century, you have this dynamic rise of a power out of south-central Tibet that is, it's so dynamic, it just sweeps up the entire plateau under this one ruling lineage, and then just overflows the plateau. And this is crucial. This period is crucial in the creation of a Tibetan identity. It's very similar, I tell my students, to what happened in the Arab world. That is to say, you have a dynamic period of explosion out of the Arabian Peninsula that overruns North Africa and spreads as far as the Fertile Crescent. And when the smoke and dust clears, everybody's an Arab. And the same thing happens in Tibet, although, beyond the plateau, it's a little, it doesn't hold as much. But essentially, when the smoke and dust clears, and I'm going to be somewhat ahistorical and somewhat vulgar about it, but, just general about it, but when the smoke and dust clears from the borders of Kashmir in the west to the shores of the Kokonor all the way in the east, everybody is the descendant of a monkey bodhisattva and a rock ogress. And by that I mean that this creates the Tibetan identity out of disparate parts. There were disparate groups that were not Tibetan. In the same way that you have this Arab identity being forged, you have a Tibetan identity being forged. And we don't know as much about the Tibetan plateau as we do know about North Africa and the Fertile Crescent area in the classical age, because we have much better records, but we do have the names of different peoples who were there, and clearly there were different languages and different belief systems. So to assume that everybody just followed just this one Pön religion, even though what we have is, in Pön, we do have, more than traces. We have survivals of certain ideas and practices from the pre-Buddhist age. But from that to reconstruct the religious period of the pre-Buddhist age on Tibet, is very, very difficult. And there's been a lot of argument about that. For a long time, there was a school in France. There's still people who say this, who say that, there never was a Pön religion. There was something called Tsuklak, and it's a long technical academic argument. You don't want me to get into that.
So in other words, it's not the indigenous.
It is a part of what was the indigenous religious picture there. But when you see Pön now, obviously with monasteries and monks and all of that, you say, oh well, this is, as an outsider, you say, well, this is Buddhist, and it's not just Westerners, wonderful Western scholars who come and say, my God, what are you saying? That's just, you're acting like Buddhists. This is just some kind of weird Buddhism. This is an argument that Tibetans were having. It's an argument that Tibetans were having. Well, is Pön actually just some kind of Buddhism? And in the 18th century, when the Qianlong emperor destroyed, amongst other places, well, not destroyed, but he destroyed the kingdom of Beri in eastern Tibet, where Pön was the religion of the rulers. One of the lamas at court said, and he wrote this, he said, obviously, Pön is not Buddhism, because the emperor is an emanation of Manjushri, and Manjushri would never go out and destroy Buddhism. So clearly, this Pön is not Buddhism. And by that I mean to say that, the ideas that Westerners have, well, is this really, is so heavily influenced by Buddhism? Should we maybe consider it a kind of Buddhism? Tibetans were having these arguments themselves. The same thing that sometimes we'll say when Tibetans have the Nyingma school have a tradition of treasure texts that were supposedly hidden, in the 8th century by Guru Padmasambhava and then found centuries later. Tibetans also say, hey, give me a break. And there's an argument about this among Tibetan sects. So.
Question right here, yeah.
Rachel, you might be able to answer this best, but I was wondering if you've seen any really noticeable differences in the style and choice of materials and subject matters between Tibetan contemporary artists that are creating within Tibet and those creating abroad, considering the different educational backgrounds or censorship.
Certainly. In the last 7 years, I've witnessed a complete change in the materials. Kaesang Lamdark, who is just here, is a really good example. Most of his work now is in plastic, molded plastic. The Dorje Drukden and Gene Simmons' face, as well as the Lama vest, and then the cans. A lot of the work that we saw in the beginning and the work that's in the collection that goes back, as far back to the 90s or even a little bit earlier into the 80s, it was all painting at that point. And now there are many different kinds of materials and a lot of video.
It's obvious the Western contemporary influence on the Tibetans working modalities that we saw in the show today. I'm interested a little bit in the influence on the Gandharan imagery that you showed earlier from the West, and whether you see specifically whether that the crowned Buddha, if you think that has any connection to imagery coming west, perhaps through the Byzantine Empire.
Well, it is actually an interesting question, because of course there are these Nike that fly around on coins and crown kings. You can take that back to Alexander the Great and, earlier in Greece. So, years ago I actually did a master's thesis trying to track halos, and it's a morass, actually, when you try to find sources for things. With at least the halo example, I tracked it all the way back to the Etruscans, but then realized the Etruscans were getting it from the ancient Near East. And by the time I got back into the ancient Near East, I was almost to Gandhara. So I didn't really need to go to Europe at all. I could have just gone to the ancient Near East and gotten my solar halos. I think that people like certain forms, and they, once they catch on, they have great fluidity, but they start to take different meanings. So I wouldn't be surprised. I haven't given it a lot of thought, but it seems perfectly reasonable. But I doubt if the meaning moved. And that's, I think, one of the things that was coming up when I was thinking of these crowned Buddhas is, how is it that, or what meanings do travel with images? How does ideology move and get attached to these symbols? Certainly it does to some extent, especially in the Tibetan context, because you move so many texts. And you bring teachers up into Tibet. Atisha, who is working at Vikramashila, goes to Toling and ultimately to Lhasa area, and brings all this ideology up into the plateau that was down in North India. With our Greek motif, probably those things traveled independent of people. Coins, things like that move with trade, and so they lose all their meaning. And so then you get motifs kind of functioning independently. And that's always been the issue with Gandhara, that you have all this style probably moving with luxury wear, but stripped of all of its kind of, in a sense, Western meaning. But it still was a cool style, and people picked it up and used it and reworked it.
Would any or all of you care to make a comparison of the development and changes of art in the Western world? Anyone who takes a beginning art course probably goes through something called world history, which will probably emphasize European countries. And proceeds, say, with symbolism, Zoroaster, Halo's meaning, all initially unrepresentational or inspired by religion as well as ethnicity. And there's been a very specific development, it seems, in Western art. Is something similar occurring, or has it occurred, that we just don't know that much in the Western art world? In Tibet, or Chinese, or what we consider Asians' influence in Asian religions.
Well, the one thing I would say is I think it's very interesting how art functions as propaganda, and how certain images have this great power and meaning, and in that sense, I think all of what we've been talking about with the contemporary production is so fascinating, because there's so much potential to be read broadly outside of Tibet. It's a different voice, and it's sort of one stripped of a lot of specific rhetoric, because when you talk about the Dalai Lama, then the Dalai Lama says certain things. If you look at just an object, the object is open to interpretation, and so, you bring these things into a new context, and they're then openly interpreted. I think that has that doesn't really answer your question, I suppose, but it is an interesting...
More specifically, we see art that was first representational, religious and supported by various religions. If this obvious has happened with Buddhism and other religions, what about development to the point where art and artists are painting or working
Yeah, I think I'll just give my opinion. Like I've done some, I've been thinking of similar things, and I've noticed that, for example, I was told the Western civilization began with all this Greek philosophy and all those things. And then in there are so many deities. Basically, it's exact deities that you find in Hindu traditions. You know, the wind god, this god, that. All of those are same. Varun Dev, you know, Indra, and all those. So I think somehow, somewhere, a long time back, there have been some kind of a connection there with regard to the images and deities. Now, also slowly, when it moves to one place to another, like in India, many of the images of Vajra would be just a thunder, like a flash, you know, bolt or something like that. And then in Tibet, it becomes more stylized and all those things. And also, I also thought it's interesting that many of art is somehow derives from philosophy. And also in philosophy also, I think, particularly in modern philosophy, since Schopenhauer, who was influenced by Buddhism, and then you have Nietzsche, you know, from Schopenhauer, and then Nietzsche from, you have Jung, or Sigmund Freud, and all those, and then Derrida and all. So I think also ideologically also, there's always been, I think, some kind of a influence in that way. But I think it's still, not many has done research on that, I think. Also with iconometry, when I saw Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, it always reminded me of Tibetan iconometry of Buddha. Almost exact same, with all hands stretched out, but body not, the legs were not stretched, but almost the same, and the measurement and everything. And I was trying to do research on the iconometry specifically. And it's interesting that in India, the oldest book that I found only talks how to separate genders, male and female. And then when it gets in Tibet, it becomes all too complicated. And I feel probably in 14th, 15th century, when everybody was very individual and bringing their own version of Buddha, I think they have to standardize it and made it, okay, you know what, we should, you know, make it systematic. And then they were like, in Tibet, Menla Tundup, or Desi Sangye, or all these people who was writing books on how to depict Buddha or all these deities. So yeah, I think many variables affect, and also there are many books talking about color specifically in Tibetan art, classical art. There is also a book that talks about how to represent sound into color. So it's almost like synesthesia. So yeah, I think there are many still interesting books that talks about art in a very yeah.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Anybody else who'd like to ask a question?
Hello, Yoni?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
I feel a little hesitant to open my mouth, but I thought I should, because I haven't really formed any comment, but I felt that Dr. Behrendt's presentation caused a huge shift in my whole understanding. If I think what you're saying is what you said, and that is that you were basically saying that we put tradition into a kind of a straitjacket, and we see modern individuality as a radical shift from the creation of images in pre-modern times. And you are suggesting that actually there was much more of a dynamic, fluid creation of images, even back when people were producing, for example, the crowned Buddha. Is that what you were saying?
Well, I wouldn't be quite so radical, but yes, I think, you know, the crowned Buddha is a good example of what was happening in India, where people were experimenting with how they were going to attach meaning to this image that I think actually attained a certain amount of popularity. In other words, people liked the crown Buddha. Sort of like from the time it appears, it's sort of all over the place, and people enjoyed that image. They thought it was an effective image, and people started assigning new meanings to it. Yeah, and reinterpreting it. I think that then had a life in different places and started to have a variety of meanings attached to it. And I think that when you start to take an image like that across to a different tradition, like Tibet, where everything is necessarily in flux because it's a moment when they're translating text, when they're moving images. I mean, we see very quickly in Tibet a very careful, like you were talking about, codification. You know, who are we dealing with? Well, you know, you start having texts very clearly delineate deities in Tibet. And oddly, many times in Tibet, we can identify a deity right off the bat and say, oh, it's so-and-so, because he's holding some specific attribute. Whereas when you get to India, oh, it's like, who knows? I mean, you know, you have these deities that, you know, are kind of fluidly holding the attribute, not holding the attribute. I mean, couldn't they decide that he holds an attribute or not holds it? But, you know, you have that flexibility. So, I mean, I think there are moments where things are changing. Guys, I'm not sure that. I think that was happening right at that moment. It was a nodal moment. I think it's kind of happening certainly today.
All right. Well, thank you once again to our panelists.